everyone. Welcome. We're about to start. Okay. So, thank you so much for being here. We've got a very packed room, and we know it's very warm, so please be drinking water if you've got any on you. My name is Isabella Kajawara. So I'm a writer and editor at Shadow Magazine, and I do some organizing with a grassroots abolitionist group called SOAS Detainee Support, as well as a collective called the East and Southeast Asian Sisters. But today we're here because I'm chairing this afternoon session from Windrush to the Rwanda plan. So over the next hour and a half, we'll be tracing how histories of colonialism, capitalism, and institutional racism have shaped border and deportation regimes from the arrival of the Empire Windrush to the present day, drawing on the past to highlight how we can resist the government's vicious, hostile environment and immigration policies. 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush, which brought over 800 Caribbean workers to England in 1958. There's been a broad sweep of momentum this year to celebrate the contributions and enduring legacy of the Windrush generation and their descendants, but this coinciding with the current state of immigration discourse and the policy making in Britain makes us question how far we've really come. The Windrush generation faced hostile reception when arriving here. For example, with the Nottingham and Notting Hill riots of 1958 and 1959, widespread police violence and vigilantism, and so much more. And now, I'm sure most of us have seen that just last week at the Conservative Party conference, Home Secretary Suella Braverman delivered a message which has been described by many as an echo of Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. Which legitimized an appeal to racial hatred and violence against marginalized peoples. Her claims that Britain faces a hurricane of mass migration, that people are allegedly pretending to be gay to seek refuge, and her description of the Human Rights Act as the Criminal Rights Act aren't just headline-grabbing statements. They're words that legitimize white supremacist, fascist ideologies and violence. Right now, we are witnessing the expansion and evolution of immigration and policing regimes, with army barracks, hotels, and even floating barges being proposed as accommodation options for refugees. But we all know that the reality is that they are not accommodating whatsoever, and if anything, are sites of quasi-detention, replicating very similar conditions to what it's like to be incarcerated. Now, ultimately, they serve as a means of disciplining and controlling Black people and other racialized communities, and they're already rotten institutions at their very core steeped in colonialism, and recent changes in policing powers are further entrenching racism into British policing and the immigration estate. The same counterinsurgency strategies used by the British state in suppressing colonial liberation struggles are historically and presently intertwined with the development of policing back here in Britain. These policing cultures share much in common, whether it's the blurred boundaries between the functions of the police and army, practices of intelligence gathering through prevent and gang membership lists, or the use of the legal doctrine of joint enterprise. We see how these cultures and practices that were rooted in colonialism are routinely and systematically used as a means of disciplining and controlling people to this day. This connection between the past and present is one reason why it's essential for us in this session to explore and illuminate the history of Black organizing and resistance to the forces of colonialism, capitalism, and institutional racism. Because to this day, these forces of colonialism, capitalism, and institutional racism continue to shape and contour our border, policing, and deportation regimes. Numerous British Black power groups were established throughout the 1960s and 70s, and regularly protesting and lamenting the repression of Black people around the world, not just in the UK, even in the supposedly post-colonial era. And it makes us understand how the success of any Black revolution, especially the success of any black revolution has an enormous impact on the situation in this country as well. Works like Adams' Black Resistance to British Policing remind us that drawing connections between histories of resistance and different kinds of black struggle against policing is vital. If we're to challenge the cutting edge of police and prison power, which harnesses new and dangerous forms of surveillance, violence, and criminalization. And now, to the recent present, which has been rocked by scandal after scandal when it comes to deeply racialized border policing and deportation regimes. In 2017, it emerged that hundreds of Commonwealth citizens, many of whom were from the Windrush generation, had been wrongly detained, deported, and denied legal rights. Falsely deemed as illegal or undocumented because of the Home Office's hostile environment legislation and bureaucratic slow violence, the impact of these people's lives sparked widespread, condemnation of the government for its failings. And amidst all of this, we've continued to witness the murders and harm of black and other racialized people at the hands of the police, white supremacists, the slow violence of the state, and border regime. 2022 saw the introduction of the Rwanda plan by the British government, whereby people who the UK identifies as being illegal or illegal immigrants or asylum seekers are to be relocated to Rwanda for processing, asylum, and resettlement. The tireless work of grassroots abolitionist groups, the migrant justice sector, lawyers, and a last-minute legal appeal meant that the plan was halted. But still, we see that the government is continuing to try to overturn this ruling and has presented Ascension Island as a plan B. 2023 has brought with it the introduction of the Illegal Migration Act, which is, a devastating blow to migrant justice organizing, which means that anyone who arrives irregularly into the UK will have their asylum claim deemed inadmissible, meaning the Home Office don't have to consider someone's claim. And of course, if we're talking about government immigration scandals, the Bibi Stockholm barge must be mentioned as well. With those not already familiar, it is a barge repurposed as a floating quasi-prison, supposedly for the purpose of reducing the cost of asylum accommodation by housing people seeking asylum there instead of in hotels or dispersed accommodation. Now, with all of that brief history said, we're joined by four incredible panelists today. So we've got Adam Elliott Cooper, Belle Ribeiro Addy, Amy Hall, and Michael Etienne, whose breadth and depth of experience will help us navigate these violent histories of past and present and where we go from here. I'd like to warmly thank them all for making the time to be here with us, some on very short notice as well. And now for introductions, which I'll try and keep short, but that's also hard because there's a lot of knowledge and experience at this table. So Adam is a lecturer in public and social policy at Queen Mary's University. He is the author of Black Resistance to British Policing and co-author of Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State. Adam's also a board member of the Monitoring Group, an anti-racist organization challenging state racism and racial violence. Belle has served as a Labour MP for Streatham since the 2019 general election, and in 2020 was briefly Shadow Minister for Immigration. She is a self-described lifelong socialist and chairs the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations. Earlier this year, she outrightly challenged Rishi Sunak in Parliament to offer a full and meaningful government apology for Britain's role in slavery and colonialism, and to commit to reparatory justice. Amy is a freelance journalist and editor whose work has appeared in publications including Red Pepper, The Ecologist, and The Guardian. She's reported on social and environmental justice, race, feminism, activism, politics, and the arts from across the UK, Cambodia, India, the US, and Belize. She's also co-editor at the reader-owned magazine New Internationalist, and was previously a news editor for the national quarterly newspaper Transition Free Press. And last but not least, Michael is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, with a broad public law and human rights practice encompassing actions against the state, in various forms, but with a focus on cases involving detaining authorities, particularly police forces and prisons. He was a member of the external legal team, acting for the Equality and Human Rights Commission in its project following Grenfell, examining the human rights implications following the tragic fire on 14th of June 2017, during phase 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. With all of that out of the way, we can launch into questions. So my first one is for Adam. So this one is centering around the history of Windrush. So what was the significance of the docking of the Empire Windrush, and how has the policing and racialization of black communities expanded and evolved in the past 75 years since then?
Cool. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. So I think there's, in terms of that first part of the question, there's, I think, a number of push factors as well as pull factors as to why the Empire Windrush docked in that post-war period. The push factors, the reasons why people from the colonial Caribbean migrated to Britain, of course, initially is about underdevelopment. Right? These Caribbean islands, colonized societies, had their entire political economy structured to serve the needs of the mother country, of the imperial nation of Britain. The plantation economies, the sugar plantations, the mills, the mines, all of these areas of industry and agriculture were solely structured to serve British markets. And so when Britain's economy went into recession in the 1930s, the people of the Caribbean began to starve. And industrial action, unemployed people's movements, poor people's movements, hunger marches were organised across the region. And so it is and as part of a consequence of this huge labour organising which took place across the Caribbean in the 1930s and 40s, we see a response of the British which is violent repression. We see gunships and other military infrastructure sent to Caribbean islands such as Trinidad. We see the shooting down of protesters and union organisers. We see large mass incarceration of union organisers as well. And so by the time we get to the mid-1940s, the people of the Caribbean are desperate, right? So their means of resistance have been in many ways crushed. Their economies are suffering, and they need to find some place else to earn a living. But of course, there was also pull factors as well. And as we know, Britain went to the Caribbean to recruit workers to come to Britain. Of course, that's the part of the story that Britain loves telling everyone, right? And one of the key reasons that the Caribbean was chosen as the place where colonial subjects should be recruited rather than parts of the African continent or parts of Southeast Asia or elsewhere is because Caribbean people were considered to be the most easily to assimilate into British culture. They were considered to be the most British of all of Britain's colonial subjects. And of course, the violent legacies of chattel slavery is one of the key reasons Caribbean people were considered to be more British, right? They did not have their own languages and religions and other cultural formations, right, because of these legacies of chattel slavery. And so this intention and dream of assimilation was also one of the key pull factors as to why Britain began to recruit in this particular corner of its vast empire. Now, the first post-war border legislation we begin to see introduced is in the 1960s, and with it we see not a betrayal of the so-called Windrush generation, as certain Liberal Johnsons like to claim, but instead we see, I think, rather a set of working populations who are not wanted in the country. And one of the key reasons I think we begin to see the emergence of this border legislation isn't simply to stop people from the British Empire or former British Empire coming to Britain. That's not simply what their purpose is. Rather, it's to serve the interests of capital. And what capital needs isn't workers to not come to Britain, because of course they need them to exploit. What they need are workers who are more readily exploitable. And workers who are more readily exploitable have more precarious immigration status. They have more vulnerability to deportation and other forms of criminalisation. And so the work of the emergence of the border regime isn't simply to stop migration, right? It's to create a more readily exploitable class of workers. Today, on top of course, the continual border regimes continuing to make these migrant workers more readily exploitable, right, by making their status in this country more precarious and making them more vulnerable to deportation and other forms of criminalisation. We also see borders playing a crucial role in enabling the government to maintain its legitimacy in the face of multiple crises. This country, many cities in this country face a housing crisis. People all over this country face a social care crisis. There's a crisis in our National Health Service. There is an environmental and climate crisis. There is a crisis of pollution and other forms of environment in our local areas. There is a crisis in our wages. There is a crisis in our cost of living, and of course there is a crisis in our pensions, and many more. And while this government is unwilling or unable, or both, to deal with these crises, they can instead tell the people of Britain that there is a crisis at our borders. Not a humanitarian crisis, which of course we all know there is, but rather a crisis of an incoming invasion. And it is that crisis which the government claims that they will deal with in order to reaffirm their legitimacy in the eyes of the electorate. And so out of this we see a massive increase in police powers and border powers. We see a huge expansion of surveillance of suspected migrants and suspected criminals. We see almost a doubling in Britain's prison population since the 1990s. And of course a huge escalation in deportations. But while this is being criticised from kind of two angles, right? On the one hand, we're seeing it criticised from parts of the Liverpool centre, who are looking at our prison system and saying, well, this prison system is overcrowded, it's unsafe, it's unsanitary, it's rat infested, infectious diseases are being spread rapidly. We're having problematic drug use, where people are using drugs in ways that are harmful. We're seeing violence. We're seeing these prisons being understaffed and therefore even more dangerous. And crucially, of course, as well, we're told that prisons reform, but they're not doing what they're supposed to do, because people who are incarcerated are more likely to end up in prison. But what if we ask a different question? What if we actually ask ourselves, maybe prison isn't failing? Maybe prison is doing exactly what it was intended to do. Maybe the purpose of prison isn't to reform, or to keep people safe, or to reduce harm, or to reduce violence. Maybe the purpose of prison actually is to maintain the existing social order. Maybe the purpose of prison actually is to make workers more precarious and more vulnerable, with the intention of making them less likely to resist, making resistance more costly. Because if you resist your boss and end up losing your job, you're more likely to end up in prison or back in prison. If you protest on the streets, or challenge stop and searches, or engage in forms of strike action, you're more likely to be criminalised and more likely to be channeled into the criminal justice system. Maybe we should think about prisons and police in the same way as we think about borders, as forms of power which are meant to make workers more vulnerable to exploitation, more susceptible to forms of precarious employment, and therefore part of a system which we need to understand as not being fundamental to racism, but also to capitalism as well. And I think if we understand prisons and borders in this wider context, we can understand that prisons and borders don't just simply target those who are in insecure migration status. They are part of a wider system of exploitation that threatens us all. And if I think we take that into consideration, hopefully we can find better and more transformative ways of ridding ourselves of this border, police and prison system as we currently see.
Thank much. Going off of that, of the the connections between race and empire and where we are today. My next question was for Amy. So, how can you speak a bit to how the histories and construction of race and empire have shaped border and deportation regimes, and how they show up in the border regime as we know it today?
Hi, thanks for having me. As you said earlier, my name's Amy and I'm a co-editor at New Internationalist magazine, and we come out every 2 months covering social and environmental justice stories around the world. And our current magazine is looking at the legacies of the British Empire and what people around the world are doing to resist them. So I guess that's kind of a bit of the background to where I'm coming from today. So I guess firstly I wanted to say that I think the same racism and the narratives that were central to the British Empire are also central to how black and brown people have been treated on these islands and within the immigration system. White supremacy was at the heart of the British Empire and the transatlantic slave trade, and the racialisation of indigenous and enslaved people has been central to European colonists amassing wealth, resources and power. As Adam was saying, capitalism, as well as like white supremacy and imperialism, work together to create categories of people considered disposable. And we've seen this with colonialism, and we see it in our border and deportation regimes, as well as in our criminal justice system. And as kind of has been talked about already a little bit, when Britain struggled to rebuild itself after World War II, people from across the colonies answered the call to help the mother country with their labour. Including my family as well. And people of that generation travelled to Britain on British passports, but were met with discrimination and racism when it came to accessing services and housing, as well as on the street. But meanwhile, people around the world were winning hard-fought independence struggles, only for those new nations to continue to be shaped by imperialism and the age-old colonial dynamics, including through debt and structural adjustment, or the devastating impacts of climate change. And as the empire began to crumble, successive British governments busied themselves redefining through legislation and political rhetoric who kind of counted as citizens of the country. And as Adam said, there was successive legislation that kind of impacted on people, not just along race lines, but also along, as you were saying, making people much more precarious. One of the things, was the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which restricted entry of Commonwealth citizens to the UK to those with work permits, which only applied to very specific kinds of jobs. And the then Home Secretary, Rab Butler, said, and this is a quote, that the Act's restrictive effort is intended to, and would in fact, operate on coloured people almost exclusively. And I think that, as has already been said, there was also a lot more of this political rhetoric around the threat that black and brown people apparently were posing to the white population of Britain. And that rhetoric we can still see today, as you said, with Braverman's kind of hurricane being a recent example. And it also gives people a place to point the finger of blame for their abandonment by successive governments, or those with the power to change things, letting people with the power to change things off the hook. And I think with the Windrush generation, or the kind of Windrush kind of scandal, however you want to term it, we saw the disposability, again, coming into play with how a lot of elders were treated. Their labour was to some extent celebrated, but once past working age, they were somehow surplus to requirements. And I think this is also stark in the reports that emerged earlier this year of long-term sick and mentally ill people from that generation being sent back to the Caribbean between the 50s and 70s. And again, this is something that kind of relates to my own family's experience. My grandmother was returned to Jamaica during this period and was hospitalised. And while I don't know the details of that situation, I know that most of her children didn't see her again, and it seems like another example of kind of exporting kind of people who can't work and who are somehow now surplus to requirements. And again, the impact that has on families and also on wider society is massive. Britain's empire was built on this kind of extraction of resources, of wealth, of labour, of people from around the world. one way or another, black and brown people have been building Britain for hundreds of years. It was just simply kind of another chapter in that story. And to reference some of the statistics that we used in the magazine to kind of illustrate some of this extraction, it's estimated that Britain extracted £7.5 trillion from African countries due to the slave trade. Europe's share of global GDP went from 20 to 60% during the colonial period. And empire spurred the Industrial Revolution, which, while Britain profited, reaping in $45 trillion from its colonial rule of the Indian subcontinent alone. And despite this, there seems to be a consistent need for Britain to try and keep up some kind of front when it comes to racism and the treatment of people considered disposable to the state. Britain seems to do like a special kind of racism where it's framed as the most humane oppressor or even somehow doing people a favour. And you see this when politicians and the right-wing media talk about migration and Britain being a soft touch or somehow the most welcoming country to migrants, while the policy is completely the opposite. And I think it's really important that we keep countering these myths wherever we can. I also think that what we've kind of seen recently is another example of how Britain likes to offshore some of its most inhumane aspects. So from managing slave plantations and carrying out other colonial horrors largely off these islands, to things like deportation centres, locking people away, and now the Rwanda plan and the provision for offshore processing. And I think that this has I think that these attempts have helped to somehow erase empire up to a point, although I think that's maybe changing a little bit, at some of its horrors. So aside from the literal destruction of documents, there has also been in many ways a successful history of trying to rebrand empire as something that wasn't really that bad. And I think that attitude is very pervasive, and again, I think these are some of the myths that we really need to challenge. I think ultimately when it comes to immigration, this history is a really important part of understanding what is happening. As Sivananda famously said, we are here because you were there, and a lot of migration to the UK has some kind of link to empire or the wealth and resources that continue to be extracted or the foreign policy decisions of Britain and its allies. As Kehinde Andrews has written, immigration in and of itself is the chickens of imperialism coming home to roost. And while stricter border policies are portrayed as what's best for people in Britain, money and capital has been given increasingly free movement, not to mention the ease at which people of all races seem to, who are the most wealthy, seem to move through the world. In his book Uncommon Wealth, Coram outlines how the rampant nature of capitalist empire has also ricocheted back home through economic and political trends, which were first tested in the colonial world, and Adam has also done loads of work on this when it comes to the criminal justice system. Coram describes a kind of boomerang effect in which things like outsourcing and privatisation have weakened labour protections in Britain, and how have increased things like privatisation and these kinds of issues. And he writes the process of confining whole populations to precarious lives began in the post-colonial world, but it is not staying there. Ultimately, the histories of empire are integral to so much of how things work in Britain today, but also including the border. And I think that confronting these legacies are key.
Thank you very much. And going on to our third question of the day. So this one is for Belle, and it's around what's been the effect of the hostile environment brought in by Theresa May in 2012, and how did it bring us to the Windrush scandal?
Thank you. Oh, gosh. Thank you very much, everybody. I can't believe it's the first day and it's gone already. We all know the hostile environment began with 2012 Immigration Act. And what that was quite specifically about was minimum income threshold and being able to bring your family members into the UK. And the reason why this was quite sinister, in my view, is that if you really want to be, and when I think about how the immigration system currently affects families, how it affects the Windrush generation, if you really want to be evil, if you really want to strike people, I suppose, where their heart is, what do? You start with their family. You start with the thing that's most difficult for people to leave behind. Everybody understands family, people understand how important their family are. And so for the government to start with this, I thought was particularly, personally I thought was particularly wicked, because you were advocating that in order for people to come here, or if they were already here, they would be subject to being separated from their partners, from their children, and if they wanted to bring anybody else over, if they wanted to maintain their family unit in any sort of way, they would be subject to some sort of very, very harsh financial penalty, or would have to meet a certain income threshold, knowing full well that many, many people from who have come, particularly to work in our public sector services from different countries, do not meet that minimum income threshold, do not make that much money. So whilst calling people over, saying you can come, but you cannot keep your family with you. You are, whilst you're coming here to work for us and for this country, we will not respect your right to a family life. And we can trace the Windrush scandal directly back to the 2014 Immigration Act. Now, at the time, there was a small group of Labour MPs who highlighted two very clear things. And one was the historic lack of immigration documentation that was provided to new arrivals, but also was the long-standing brutal treatment of individuals concerned at the hands of the Home Office. And because of that particular combination, those Labour MPs predicted something like the Windrush scandal would occur. So when you heard, what was her name again? That one we got sacked. Amber Rudd, thank you very much. Amber Rudd, when you heard Amber Rudd apologising, I thought to myself and saying, oh, we never thought that this would happen. Of course, it would have happened. When you look at what the legislation was effectively asking, and you know, this was true when, this is particularly true when we look at what Theresa May was advocating, deport first and appeal later. Anybody who's had any sort of dealing with the Home Office will know that they are quite possibly one of the most incompetent institutions on earth. Quite literally, you're dealing with people's lives, and they will sometimes, in a fit of, I don't know what they're doing, copy and paste something from another application, citing a different country and a different name, or to reject you and then make you pay thousands of pounds for an application again because they have got it wrong. The types of things that they do in there are outrageous, and any other organisation would be shut down if they behaved like that. So the idea that you would deport people first and appeal later was absolutely crazy. We knew what would happen because we know, and if you've worked in these spaces for some time, that if they get you out of the country, you are not coming back. And they will make that as difficult as possible. And those Labour MPs were, of course, right about what was going to happen. There are three of them still in the House, Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, and two of them are currently not Labour MPs. Now, there are others who actually claimed that they were very much against it, obviously, when the whole scandal broke, because they abstained. Now, my view on abstentions, when it comes to particular pieces of legislation, especially when they affect people in this way, that an abstention is a very, very clear message that you do not care enough to do anything. So I don't rate those at all. They may as well have voted for it. And we know that there's a long history of anti-immigrant sentiment in all of the legislation across this country that we've seen across a number of years in this country. And we keep being told, oh, part of the problem is that we spend too much time, I suppose, talking about these issues. But the reason why we do that is because they keep bringing up different pieces of legislation. If you've worked in immigration law before, or supported migrants, particularly those seeking asylum, it's really difficult to... sorry, was that my voice? Did I just crack? It's really... No power. Oh, this is going to be fun. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Great. It's really difficult to keep up with all of the different legislation as they keep changing it. And they keep having a go at these immigration lawyers, but I think they're absolutely brilliant for the simple fact that they keep changing the legislation and these lawyers keep beating them at their own game. I think they're heroes. It's sad to say, but it is true that the Tories didn't actually originate the term hostile environment. It was first used by one of our own MPs, one of our own immigration ministers, and he said he was trying to create a much more hostile environment in the country, so that if you're here illegally, whatever illegally is supposed to mean. And in the party as a whole, sometimes we're seeing this dreadful rhetoric and policy kind of leaving its mark. And nowadays, it's under the guise or pretense of trying to appeal to red wall voters, and that is a lot of rubbish. It's not anti-immigrant voters who effectively are the problem. More than anti-migrant politicians that we need to worry about, and the same is happening now. I mean, Suella Braverman makes Theresa May look like a bit of a saint, and you know, she's just been making up statistics and just peddling lies and promoting racism and hatred for weeks now, partly to cover up for her complete failure over the Rwanda policy. And actually, how many millions of pounds it's costing this country just so that she can make a point and potentially make a claim for the Prime Minister of this country. But so many different Tory policies that have ruined our lives have been because one of these individuals thinks that they are the second coming and that they should be in charge of this country. And I think that what we should be doing as a movement, and as a party actually, is nailing each and every one of those lies, such as the claim that, you know, those people that are on the small boats are all economic migrants. I've been to Calais more than once, and to some of the other refugee camps across Europe, and I can tell you from personal experience that that's not true. And it's not true of those that have made it across. And she knows that it's not true. Actually, her own department's data has shown that it's not true. And that's why with so many different individuals, she cannot remove them from this country, because they have a right to be in this country under international law. And that's why she continuously tries to make up ways to block them. And I worry because I don't think there are any votes to be won here. And if we don't have any pushback to this, it just leaves the field clear for you know, the Tories to keep peddling the idea. I don't think voters are attracted by anti-migrant sentiment, and you know, the reality is that anybody that is thinks that way about migrants, as far as I'm concerned, it's very unlikely that they're going to vote Labour no matter what you say to them, because, quite frankly, the Tories are better at being wicked to migrants than we are. And obviously you're going to go with the person that's the best at the thing, at doing the thing that you like the most. And, you know, if the courts don't again block the Rwanda deportation policy, we're going to see lives ruined again, and we're going to see you know, people continuously baying for the more reactionary forces across Britain. But I think that's a long shot, unfortunately, in getting it stopped the next time, because they seem so hell bent on it. But I put my faith in those lawyers again, because they've done a brilliant time. They've done a brilliant job so far, and I think you know, we'll give them another go, and hope that we actually just have another government the next time round. But I don't think that's going to be as easy as some people think it is. So it's clear that the government have continued to push down on this anti-migrant sentiment, and even in the spaces where we've seen that they're meant to take action when it comes to the Windrush generation, and that they were meant to reverse all of those things that affected the Windrush generation. They've even, you know, as of July this year, stopped assessing the impact of the hostile environment on the Windrush generation. So all of the work that was going on the Home Office ethical standards units has now stopped. And that it was meant to be an internal campaign to stop treating people like crap, but they've just given up on it. And you know, so it's clear under Suella Braverman that the impact of the hostile environment legislation will no longer be considered. And that makes me question how it's going to still continue impacting people from the Windrush generation. Obviously, they still have to pay the compensation, because we do understand that there was a pot of money set aside. But at the moment, we're seeing far too many Windrush survivors actually dying before they receive any money. Their family members left behind don't receive anything. We know that people ended up being taken back or deported back and have not actually received any compensation or a way back into this country. So it's been extremely difficult. And I just want to touch on, sorry, going on for a bit, on how it's had a knock-on effect for young people in this country, and how some of our children from EU countries are coming under it, and children from many other different countries as well. And some of these children could be born in this country. So the hostile environment did not only impact people who were born outside of the country. You could be the child of someone who was born, outside the country, born in this country, had a British passport, and be able to claim British citizenship. But if you did not have £1,000 and your parents were not aware, you may get to a certain age and then not claim, and then not realise that you are not a British citizen. You could be born on the same day as someone who has exactly the same economic situation, so you went to the same school and have absolutely pretty much the same life as you had. You both get to age 14, 15, you don't get a national insurance number, you're not sure why, you're not eligible to work, you can't go to university unless you're willing to pay international student fees, you cannot rent a flat because you are not considered a British citizen, you cannot travel, all of these different things. And they made it all seem as if it was to stop illegal migration, or what they termed to be illegal migration, and all it did was affect people predominantly from black communities. So that's what it was. It was pure. It was racism, pure and simple, and that is in a roundabout way how we got to where we got to, and also why we shouldn't, as a party, I think, be going down the road of supporting the Tories on this.
Going off of, part of what you said about like the tireless work of lawyers keeping up with the endless treadmill of legislation that is thrown at us, and announcements that are made every day. I was going to turn to Michael next to get a bit more perspective about some of the implications of the Illegal Migration Act for legal advocacy and grassroots movements, and how we can collaborate more effectively to address this changing landscape. What kind of approaches we might need to consider in the face of it all.
Great, well, thanks very much. I'll try my best to keep my voice up. Luckily, they train you at bar school for these kinds of things. First of all, health warning, I don't practice immigration law. Right? That's not part of my practice. And I mention that partly so that no one asks me any technical immigration questions later, but also to pick up on Belle's point, which is one of the reasons I don't do it is because it's one of the most important areas of law for the people who are affected by these rules. And it's also one of the areas of law where the rules and the regulations and the guidance change with such speed, it's incredibly difficult to keep on top of it all. And if it's difficult for people who have got legal educations and university degrees and all the rest of it to keep on top of, where does that leave the people, or a lot of the people, who are trying to secure their safety in this country? And none of that is accidental, right? A lot of immigration law changes by regulations, right? So that's different from primary legislation. And what that means is it's much easier for the government to change the rules. And I've got sort of two introductory thoughts to kind of put out there for the rest of what I'm going to say. And the first one is, if you sometimes hear about immigration being talked about and you think, well, it doesn't really affect, it's very bad, it's very sad, but it doesn't affect me, so I don't worry about it too much. And in one sense, I can understand that, right? There's the weight of things that we have to worry about can feel almost overwhelming. But the reality is, what starts with foreigners is coming for you. Right? That's just the fact of it. And we can see that looking at what happened with the Windrush scandal, what happened with secret courts, this thing which started to deal with the war on terror in the early 2000s, secret courts suddenly became a thing which was available in general civil litigation, quote unquote, ordinary people also being put through these processes that are available to basically keep more of what the government wants to keep secret, right? And the other one is, I think, talking about the Immigration Act is, I think we have to be careful in some ways not to treat it as if it's this like exceptional creature. In some ways, I say that with two faces, because in some ways we have seen it all before. It is a culmination of all of the things that the other panel members have been talking about. You know, the government of this country, whatever colour it is, political colour I mean, has been obsessed with immigration since the 60s at least. You know, this idea that suddenly, oh, we've got all this wealth, but we want to keep out the people who have actually built it for us and from whom we have taken it. And I think if I'm looking at the last, the other thing I'm saying is almost all of the criticisms I have of the law and the legal position apply to this shower of a Tory government, but they are almost all equally applicable to the Labour government. The next one or the previous ones. You know, we have had hawkish Home Secretaries from the Labour Party consistently. David Blunkett, Jackie Smith, you know, all the rest of it. There is a comfort which exists in the Labour Party at the moment, with a very important honourable exception of Bell, who is genuinely an exceptional MP, and we are exceptionally lucky to still be able to get people like Bell into the House of Commons and keep them there. But the party machine, which is a very, very different thing, is just as bad, if not worse. And if you want to test that, here's an easy one. Ask any shadow front bench member of the Labour Party which of the Tories' most recent legislative changes or future proposals they would either repeal or not enact. And the answer is going to be, we're in a terrible mess. We just can't say. So back to Rwanda. This session is Windrush to Rwanda. And I think for me, as a lawyer looking at it, a lot of what we're seeing now is making lawful what was unlawful in decades past, right? And a lot of what's happened to the Windrush generation, right? They're not being able to quote unquote prove their entitlement to be here, their landing documents being destroyed by the government, people being left not being able to access work because they don't have state-recognised immigration status. The government hasn't introduced legislation to prevent that happening. It has legislated in many ways retrospectively to make sure that more people end up in the position that the Windrush generation were in, right? And the political treatment of the Windrush generation is a scam. It is a scam on the public because the government doesn't really care. And the Windrush generation have been positioned as this kind of valorised quote-unquote immigrant community because it suits government to do that. But the reality is they don't particularly care. Because if they did, some people would have lost their jobs for what happened, and some of them might have even ended up in prison. So that's why I say I think we're looking at making lawful now what was previously unlawful. Importantly, and I think this goes to the question about effective collaboration, is we can't just look at immigration legislation on its own, right? There has been a whole panoply of legislation that's been passed recently to make it harder to challenge the state and to legalise things that were illegal. Another example, what's called the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, basically was the government's way of legislating to make lawful things like police officers, male police officers having intimate relationships with female activists, cheating them and deceiving them and building lives with them and having children with them for decades, and then disappearing and completely destroying lives and communities. Any state that felt genuinely sorry about that would put into legislation this kind of behaviour is unequivocally unlawful, and anyone who does it will go to prison, and the people affected by it will be will be compensated and protected. That's not what happened. They've passed legislation which has the effect of legalising that kind of behaviour. The Police, Crime, Courts and Sentencing Act, what was called the PCS bill, right? Really, really important because it was the genesis for the Kill the Bill movement, right? This idea that the bill that we wanted to kill was this bill, because again, brings in more draconian policing powers to stop people, not just to stop people protesting, but to discourage them from leaving their house to protest in the first place. And again, it's important to see all of these pieces of legislation together, because what's happening is the state is sucking up more and more powers to be more and more invasive in our lives, whilst simultaneously making it harder for us to do anything legally about it. And I will make it clear to you now, I am not the kind of lawyer that's going to sit here and say the rule of law is going to save us. The rule of law is not going to save us. It was never going to save us, right? These kinds of ideas, they're really comforting, right? They kind of speak to this kind of liberal British notion of what justice is, and you can quote French philosophers on the rule of law and all the rest of it. The reality is, concepts like the rule of law, even concepts like human rights, they are political concepts, and they are vulnerable to the whims of the politicians of the day, who will wield them essentially for their own ends. And if they feel like they've given too much power away, they will find ways to repeal what they have generously bequeathed to us. And so we have Suella Braverman talking about the Criminal Rights Act, for example, and this idea we need to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, and so on, right? It's not really about sovereignty or any of that, it's about insulating state power. So I think it's really important for us to see all of those struggles as being interconnected struggles. And although the government passed the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act, the mobilisation by community organisers across not just political groups, but the Gypsy Roma Traveller community, who were also under attack. Workers' rights also under attack, union rights, of course, under attack. And what the government, I think, had underestimated was the willingness of those groups to come together and find ways to put pressure on the government. And the reality is, when you live in a parliamentary democracy where the government of the day has, at that point, an 80-seat majority, it was never going to, the reality was never going to be that the bill was going to get stopped in Parliament. But we have to look at other ways we stop. And it's, ideas about becoming ungovernable. So we keep going out to protest, and we say, if you're going to threaten to arrest us, then we will take that chance where we can. And not everyone can do that, but there are people who are prepared to do that and have done that. Stansted 15, for example, just this summer, 3 people acquitted of, I can't remember what the particular charges were, but they had tried to stop a deportation flight to Jamaica and got on the runway and tried to stop the flight. I think there is, in a national sense, a need to kind of get to grips with the reality that we have to look beyond law. And the power of the history of organised resistance in this country is, those of us who have organised from those groups have always known that the law is a plaything of politicians, and you're always vulnerable to who's in charge. Now, a few things about the immigration, what's called the Illegal Immigration Act itself. Having said that we have to be careful not to exceptionalise it, there are some things about it that we, I think, can't underestimate. First and foremost, this is a wholesale rejection of what was the post-war consensus on the protection that states would offer to people fleeing war, persecution, and violence. Really important to note, as the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants does in its analysis of the Illegal Immigration Act, that we have to be careful not to just confine our ideas of who is quote unquote entitled to asylum based on whether or not they're coming from a country that's at war, right? Because that's one of the government's favourite tricks. Because then they go, oh, but you've come from, for example, Albania. Well, there's no war in Albania, and you've come through X number of other countries, so you can't possibly have a valid claim to asylum, so you must be gaming the system. Right, so I think we have to keep in our minds as well that like you can't recognise an asylum seeker just by looking at a person, you know. And there is deep persecution that goes on, including in this country, against people by their governments that we have to see more than just people who are fleeing war. Although fleeing war is something to be. I'm not saying that fleeing war is not serious. It is, but we have to be careful not to allow that to become the only way in which we are quote-unquote prepared to recognise people as entitled to come to this country. And of course, even those people who are fleeing war do not get to come to this country and apply for asylum in the ways that they tell us. If you're living in Palestine under constant occupation, you don't get help to come to the UK to claim asylum. The other point to note is that there are basically no legal routes to travel into this country to claim asylum. None. And so when politicians are saying, well, you've come here illegally, and so we are rendering inadmissible your application, that's one of the things that this piece of legislation does, right? If you've come here by irregular or unlawful means, you're out automatically. But there are basically no routes to come here, with very few exceptions. And all of those exceptions, almost all of them are inadequate, right? They only cater for a small fraction of the people who are affected. So we've had schemes for people from Afghanistan, including people who've been interpreters for British forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, who were duped into thinking that if they helped British forces, they would be rewarded and given sanctuary and safety in this country. Sound familiar? Come to London and help keep our NHS running, and we'll look after you and we'll look after your families. 30 years later, the Windrush scandal happens. Oops, sorry. So it is a wholesale rejection of a particular type of consensus. And one of the things that's also really important to note is when they say that they were going to render people's applications inadmissible, they've had a power to do that before this piece of legislation. But I think this piece of legislation goes a step further because it doesn't matter who you are. It actually doesn't matter about the validity of your claim. And so what that means is there are people who are victims of torture and other heinous crimes who, on an ordinary application of the immigration system in this country, will be entitled to claim asylum, who will be rejected at the door. And so we come to Rwanda and the Rwanda plan. Another important thing which I had actually underestimated, I think, when I've been doing some thinking about the Rwanda plan. The Rwanda plan isn't just the idea that the government is going to send people from this country to Rwanda pending the determination of their asylum and immigration applications. That's true, but the decision making is going to happen in Rwanda. You know, these people aren't even, quote unquote, going to Rwanda in the hope that they are going to end up coming here one day, because to become liable to be sent to Rwanda, it's because the Home Secretary or her department has made a determination that your application is inadmissible. And so there are going to be lots of people who are just never going to get to claim asylum in this country, and of course that's entirely the point. The other thing about the schemes which exist, they reflect not commitments to international norms about asylum protection, but the government's geopolitical interests. And so we have a scheme for Ukraine because the government has geopolitical interests in supporting Ukraine in a proxy confrontation with Russia. There are schemes for people who were coming from Hong Kong at the time when protesters were being violently suppressed in Hong Kong because there's geopolitical interests around Hong Kong, and that of course is why we don't have wider schemes that cover the rest, anywhere near like the rest of the world. So what does this mean for organising? In some senses, you know, the people that I know who organise have never been tricked into thinking that the law was going to be the simple answer. People have always recognised that law is a means to an end, right? So I'm not saying that the law doesn't matter. The law does matter because it's the law that regulates state power. So of course it matters, but it's not an end in itself. And so in some senses, those people will keep organising. But what is now going to be harder is lots of people are going to come into the country and come out again before anyone's even had a chance to make contact with them. And so then we look again and we take a step back and we look more broadly and we think, well, the legal aid system in this country has been deliberately decimated. And in the context of immigration, we see deliberate and violent propaganda spewed by this government about immigrants, about their lawyers, and about the whole system, exactly because it facilitates violence. Right, violence can take many forms, but it includes physical confrontations and violence. Not so long ago, we had far-right groups setting up outside detention centres, essentially with the 2022 version of pitchforks. You know, that's really where we're at. So we have to look at this as a cross-community issue, an issue that affects all of us who care about the rights of people because they are human beings. And because we know what starts with the foreigners is coming for the rest of you. I'm already at risk because I could claim citizenship in the Caribbean. And so if I misbehave, I might end up in a situation like Shamima Begum, abandoned by this government and told, well, you can claim citizenship somewhere else. So the precarity of status has not changed, but the scale of the challenge is growing. The consensus under which a lot of NGOs and charitable and legal intervention happens is disintegrating. And I will finish by saying that the Rwanda plan legal cases are that the government has appealed, surprise, surprise. So the Court of Appeal found recently, I think it was March, that the Rwanda plan was unlawful because the system of asylum protection and processing of applications in Rwanda was too unsafe and too unpredictable. But a really important point to note, and it's one that we don't like to make as organisers because it kind of lacks a bit of the pizzazz, but it is really important if we're dealing with the reality of the situation. The court did not say that the Rwanda plan as a matter of principle was unlawful. It just said this iteration of this plan is unlawful. So the law is willing to accept this kind of idea. That appeal is being heard in the Supreme Court starting on Monday morning, and so we don't even know where we'll be at the end of the Supreme Court case. If the government wins, the case is likely to go to the European Court of Human Rights, I would imagine, and if it goes to the European Court of Human Rights and the individuals are successful, you know what will happen next. It will be the latest push to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. I said that was the last thing I was going to say, but one last thing. Just to really drive home this idea that this all affects all of us right now. And you have to find ways to deal with it right now. And by the way, that doesn't mean having to be a community organiser if you don't feel like that's the thing that you need to do. It can start with the conversations that you have with other people about these types of issues. Changing the narrative, changing the discussion, changing the boundaries of what's acceptable in conversation is such an important place to start. That I guarantee you, almost wherever you live, there are groups organising. If you want to get involved yourselves, do. Those groups always need funds, always need other types of resources. Get involved in them. But just to leave you with this, last week, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, announced that the government is consulting with European countries about the possibility of, quote, foreign prison rental to ensure public protection. What does that mean? It means paying other countries to send out people from prisons in this country to other countries to deal with overcrowding. Like I said, this is the Rwanda plan for prisons. What starts with foreigners ends with the rest of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I mean, kind of riffing off what Michael has said, leading into the next question for all of you to answer, if you may, is, you know, with this ever-expanding, ever-evolving mechanisms that are like of discipline being employed by the state, with the game and the rules of the game constantly changing. What does resistance to this oppression look like in the past, present, and future? Where can we draw inspiration from? You know, starting from that idea of becoming ungovernable and, you know, linking across community. What does this mean in practice? What does this mean for, you know, each of us at this table and everyone in the audience as well? So I put forward that question to whoever wants to begin answering it. Maybe starting with the table first. Yeah.
I'm thinking about a lot of the pieces of legislation that have gone by in the past that we've been able to challenge quite specifically. I think by all of the types of resistance that you've heard talked about before. People have protested, people have marched, people have had a go at their MPs in a way that I suppose they haven't on some issues. I think about how the Windrush scandal was exposed. Yes, it was exposed because people started writing articles about it, but there are a lot of migrant rights organisations that were looking into this issue beforehand, and it was something that was known to us. There was a whole build-up towards it. It wasn't just, I suppose, the publication of it. That helped make the news, that helped set the stage for us to keep having a go at Amber Rudd. We've now remembered her name, until she got to the point where she had to apologise. But it took that grassroots activism to get to that point, and that's why it's so key in terms of pushing people. And you have to remember that at some point the Labour Party did have good policy, and I was proud to be a part of that. We had a Shadow Home Secretary in Diane Abbott for 5 years, I can't remember now, 5 years, who completely changed Labour's policy on immigration. It's not impossible if you have somebody that would genuinely listen to what I think people across this country would like to see. I don't think if you read the Daily Mail and all sorts of things like that, which I don't, unless I have to because they put my name in it, you will find that, you know, people in this country are more welcoming than others think they are. I think it's really awful to try and set policy on the basis that you think people are really angry with migrants. Because actually, when you break down even those that are angry with migrants, you find out what it is. You get down to the bottom of it. They're talking about, housing. There's not enough housing. There's not enough, hospitals are overcrowded, etc. It always comes down to resources. Yes, there are some bigots that are like, I just don't like them because of X, Y, Z. But mostly, it's people who have been sold the lie that the reason why this country is in the state that it is because of people from somewhere else. And that's not true at all. And I think if we just continue to challenge that, it makes a massive difference. I remember seeing a picture of Diane and Jeremy Corbyn actually on the last barge that they tried to put migrants on many years ago, and people campaigning against that, and they also managed to keep that particular movement managed to keep the bars of that particular barge. But I wanted to raise the point quite specifically on making sure that we include those that are the most affected by this. migrants themselves, those that are directly affected. It's important that obviously we show the solidarity that we do, but there's something which I think people don't realise, and many people who are here on certain types of visas from different countries don't realise. And actually, because of the hostile environment, they have been given something that some minoritized communities in this country are struggling with when it comes to the changes in voter ID law. If you are from a Commonwealth country, you have the right to vote. Any Commonwealth country. If you are here on a 1-year visa, a student visa, 2-year visa, or have indefinite leave to remain from Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Ghana, Jamaica, Barbados, you have the right to vote in this country. You don't have to be a British national, and that's something that EU nationals don't even have. And because of the hostile environment, you have something which some of us here don't have, and that is a biometric residency card, which is your ID. And there are so many Commonwealth nationals who are being subjected to increased visa charges who do not know that they have the right to vote, who don't know that in all of those marginal seats that are coming up across the country, people are genuinely scared about whether or not they are going to be the MP at the next general election, whether they're going to tip it over the edge and it's going to be a Labour gain. It would be great if they could hear from those people, hear from them in their hundreds and their thousands, because they do exist in their hundreds and their thousands. We're talking about a good few hundreds of thousands of people that could be the difference between a win and a lose in a constituency. If they could hear from them that they do not think this is acceptable and they will use their vote in a certain way, I do actually believe we could change things, but that's only going to change if we go out and make sure that they know that they can vote and that they register to vote.
Okay, I'm just going to say a couple of specific things. One of the things I think I've been really excited about is the kind of growth in anti-raids groups. Join your local anti-raids group, resisting immigration raids, educating people about raids. And I think it's like one of those things that people don't think happens as much as it does in their community. They don't really realise. I know when I've done stores in Brighton where I live, people have been surprised how many raids happen. And it's really important to try and resist these raids and to try and give people more time, basically, in their cases, and we've seen that it's possible. I also wanted to, I saw that there's a protest planned on Monday at 2 p.m. Against the Bibi Stockholm, marching to the HQ from outside of here, I think, of the company that's behind that. And then I guess the final thing I wanted to say, which I think is a form of resistance that I've been a bit slow to come to, but also trying to make space for joy within our activism. I wanted to big up again the Black Anti-Racism Community Organisation in Brighton, who have been working really hard on that front to organise things like Domino's Days, where different generations come together, play games, eat food, and the things that can come from those kinds of spaces are also really important. So just wanted to give a shout out for Joy.
A couple of things I wanted to shout out. I think the first one is look out for your local cop watch group. Great, someone's in the house. Someone apart from me, that's good. Cop watch groups have been set up across the country to bring people together in community spaces and also to share knowledge and political education, and also things like know your rights, right? So understanding what, in the case of Cop Watch, what police powers, what the police are legally or not legally entitled to do, and challenging that when you see it. And it dovetails as well with immigration resistance, right? The kind of overriding idea is all of these things, we are told, exist on the basis that we have consented to them, right? Policing by consent, one of the biggest propagandist falsehoods of the recent time, is this idea that this is all happening with our consent, and without our consent it lacks legitimacy. So let's be out there where we can and how we can and say, well, we're not just going to look away when something happens or we see something happening. We're going to intervene. And intervention is something that has to be done carefully and can't always be done by everyone all of the time. But find your local cop watch groups, Green and Black Cross, NetPol, the Network for Police Monitoring, ditto with immigration raids. because sometimes intervention can be standing and bearing witness to something. I know that for a lot of people, and sometimes even for me, the idea of intervening personally feels really scary, right? But I think one of the things that we all have to try to find ways to do is not be subdued by our fear, right? Because that's what the government is running on more than anything at the moment. And it's a really important point that what people are really worried about is not being able to keep their homes, not being able to heat their homes, and not being able to eat in their homes. And if we could all find ways to draw together to help each other deal with some of those challenges, everything else becomes a little bit easier. And just as an example, it's something that happened a lot during lockdown. Mutual aid groups started. Local communities set up their own WhatsApp groups and email groups, all the rest of it, so that vulnerable people who were not able to get out could still access the world and get the things that they needed. And that is the point I make no apology for repeating. There is nothing too small. When people get arrested after protests, people are running monitoring programs to support who's going in, check when they're coming out. When people go to court, people want to have people in the public gallery to support them, to let them know that they're not there alone. These are all small things that you can do. And if those aren't the types of things that you can do, if you are involved in providing therapy or massage or physio or any of the things that we just need to take care of our well-being, make space for people who are organising and let them know that they can come to you. Because a lot of these things, as you know, are not open to everyone.
I was going to say something very, very small about non-compliance. Because although policing by consent is a big propaganda thing, a lot of these forms of immigration and border control do require our participation and consent, particularly for public sector workers, right? If you work in education or in healthcare or in youth provision, lots of different forms of work. The immigration authorities want you to participate in their bordering regimes, right? And it's very important for us to not comply with those things, right? And in a university, they want you to send registers because it's going to go to the Home Office, so you don't have to do a register. You can just send the register around the class, and whoever gets, whatever gets ticks, nothing to do with me, right? So you can do all of these things, and we cannot comply with that. I think it's really important, and again, it can feel like a small thing, but it's something we can do every single day in our working lives that I think can make a fundamental difference, not only to an individual person who might have insecure immigration status, but it's also part of a wider struggle to refuse being a part of this violent system of bordering.
And my final question for everyone here at the table is, how do we even describe what we're facing now? I mean, I know that in a way we have for the past hour, but what is on the horizon right now? Because it feels like there's a lot, but there's always, the goalpost is always being moved. It's becoming increasingly blurry. What do you think we can expect from the coming months and even the time after that?
Spoiler alert, it's not cheerful. Look, it's not cheerful because we're in a mess. And by we, I don't just mean the people in this country. We've got a climate catastrophe which is happening right now, as we speak, as we sit in this room. I think what's likely to happen is there'll be a general election, the Tories will probably lose, and Keir Starmer will take it as a great vindication of him and his version of the Labour Party, and we will go back to very much of what we had under Blair's Labour governments. But what I also think will happen is communities and people will continue to organise in their own spaces. And one of the things that happened following the summer of George Floyd's murder is that more people came out and got involved in what's happening in their local spaces and said, I want to do my bit and I'm not going to be afraid. And I think more people will do that because I think, quite frankly, we've all just had about enough.
So I think internationally try and also put pressure on governments not to collaborate with our government in some of these plans. But also, I think, yeah, as has kind of already been said, I think that anti-migrant sentiment is likely to be further stoked in the run-up to the election. And I think that whichever government gets in, that is something that we're going to need to work on together. And I think we're also going to see, yeah, again, sorry, it's not really cheerful, a lot of really oppressive policies being wrapped up in like common sense or those kinds of things. And again, I think these kinds of narratives are really important to challenge.
And I think, as you've heard already, they're definitely going to come after the us complying with human rights, international human rights legislation, which I think is a huge worry, and that will definitely be done regardless of the outcome of Rwanda in the courts. Again, all in the aim to stoke up divisions ahead of the next general election. We've also seen already, but I feel like it's going to be ramped up, this attempt to pit migrants against each other. So increasing visa fees for people who are here on certain types of visas, and saying that they have to do that because of those seeking asylum taking up lots of resources, when the reality is that just about all of the contracts the Home Office has for asylum are outsourced to private companies for their mates who take millions and millions of pounds of the taxpayer. Usually for people who should probably have been given their right to stay in this country, but they're making so much money off them that's not going to happen. We're going to see a further increase in privatisation of the immigration detention estate, so that in case they should lose the general election, the Tories are firmly making sure that all of their friends are making all the money off it that they can in the lead up. And in the lead up to that, things are just going to become even more vile in order to ensure that they are able to amass all of this wealth from human misery. So those are the things we've got to look out for, and also, as you've already heard, the potential that we may not have the greatest resistance to it politically, and the only way that's going to change is if there's resistance in the wider community that pushes on those MPs. And I cannot stress to you how much coming up to a general election, individuals who have the same job as me are going to be very, very sensitive about whether or not this is going to impact whether they have a job come the next general election. So we really, really need to harness that and push as much as we can.
Just conscious of time, sorry, I know we're a little bit over, but we did start a bit late. But yeah, opening it up to any questions from you in the audience. I see a couple hands back there. I think in the leopard print, yeah?
Hi, thank you, Speaker, and the panel. I just wanted to bring to your attention here in Liverpool. My name's Bea Freeman. I'm a historian, and I've been documenting our black community now for some 30 years. But I'm just bringing to your attention, we talk about the hostile environment, but the hostile environment started here in Liverpool in 1919 with the removal of African seamen. It also started right outside here in Chinatown when they rounded up Chinese seamen, removed them overnight, right here from what used to be the boarding houses, and their families never ever knew. Women, wives have died thinking that their husbands or partners had left them and had gone back to China. Now what's happening here in Liverpool, there is a campaign going on, set up to get the truth about what happened to those Chinese seamen. Because nobody ever knew. And they used the old 1848, it was the Seamen's Act, the African Seamen's Act, to remove people. It didn't just happen to the Chinese. In 1919, Charles Wotton was murdered here in Liverpool. a seaman, and there was a campaign against that, and they were removing Africans in 1919 under that old 1848 Seaman Act. And we've mounted numerous campaigns over the years. We're still campaigning because there's a lot of truth got to come out under this, well, the many governments that have gone. And you were talking about how people could get involved, what they should do. You know, I'm not Chinese, but I'm involved in that Chinese campaign because it's important, you know, for those families who felt that, who never knew where their fathers had gone. And I think George Alagaya, rest in peace, he came here to Liverpool, and I don't know if any of you've seen his documentary, but look out for it, because in that he goes right through the legislations, the scenarios, everything. And I think, you know, that's, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. The history didn't start in 2012. You know, it's been going on since 1919, right here in Liverpool.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for bringing that to everyone's attention, that piece of, you know, local but also international history in so many ways, and yeah, really appreciate that. I'm not sure if anyone at the table wanted to.
Maybe we should hear more.
Yeah, or more questions from the audience. Yeah, right.
Thank you very much. Roland Austin from Justice for a Windrush Generation. I'm so glad you raised that point there. This narrative about the hostile environment started in 2012. I don't want to say I am feel insulted, but I'm along that route. Anyone that has followed or has experienced hostility from the Home Office regarding the Windrush generation and their descendants know that the hostility started as early as 1970. For those that have actually had the experience. We also know, heard the MP there, Bell from the Labour Party, mention lawyers. There are a number of institutions, organizations, and individuals that have absolutely failed the Windrush generation. Lawyers are included. Members of parliaments are included as well. And we also know that the hostility towards the Windrush generation was not something that happened to them. And it's very important that we understand and speak about it in that manner and that tone. It did not happen to them. It was done to them. And there's a difference there. We also know, as a matter of fact, and it's evident, that the hostility towards the Windrush generation and the policies that came out that target them were influenced by a racist ideology. That is fact. Now let's delude ourselves for a minute and assume that those mindset that influence those policies no longer exist. And this is directly to the MP Bell, because we know that to a great extent, we talk about the Tory, we know to a great extent that the Labour Party or individuals within the Labour Party also facilitate and encourage the hostile environment towards the Windrush generation and their descendants. Now we've heard the utterances from the Labour Party and others. This is a direct question to the Labour MP. Now that you know about it, now that we all know about it, have you got any confidence that the Labour Party is going to take any impactful action to put the Windrush generation and their descendants back in the position that they would have been in had they not been targeted by the hostile environments, the Home Office, etc., etc.? That is a direct and a close question. It's a long road of a yes or no, to be honest with you. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, I completely agree with you. Lawyers have failed on a number of occasions. I used to work in immigration law myself, and sometimes people would come to us that had gone to other lawyers who could see what was happening, and at some point took a lot of money from people. knowing that they couldn't resolve the situation without a change in the law, and I thought that was an absolute disgrace. So credit to the lawyers that don't do that, and shame on the lawyers that had continued to do that, taking more and more money off people, and not seeking to resolve their situation. And you know, I don't think you're wrong. MPs on both sides of the House have facilitated this. It's very, very clear that it was a Labour MP that coined the term hostile environment, and that even those that simply abstained against that particular Immigration Act, as far as I'm concerned, were doing a huge disservice to people they were meant to represent, because they allowed this situation to go ahead. In terms of what the Labour Party are going to do, and confidence in the Labour Party, and I always have to stress this, and I understand that it is very difficult, because you only ever see somebody like myself, and when I say like myself, somebody who's willing to say certain things when it comes to the Windrush generation in spaces like this. And so it makes sense that you're going to ask me about what it is that the Labour Party are going to do, but I can tell you that it really is, and I don't say this flippantly at all, above my pay grade. There are people in more senior positions than me that make these decisions, and I don't think they're right. I lobby them, I speak to them, I speak about it in the House of Commons. They know exactly what my views are on this issue, but what I'm calling on all of you to do is make sure that they know what your views are on this issue. Because the reality of the situation is, I know that unless we can prove to them in numbers that there are people that do not believe that this should be going ahead, they are not going to budge on this, because they have a very, very strong, really awful media that take the time to convince them that there are votes to be won on the other side of the argument, or that there are votes to be won not saying anything at all. So whilst I would not say it's our fault, because it isn't our fault at all that those who are representatives, others like myself, are not taking the stand on the issues they should do. What I will say is that if we do not mobilise in our numbers to ensure that we push and force them to take the right stance on these issues, then it's not going to happen. And I can tell you that if we don't do that, then I do not have the confidence that what needs to be done in terms of protecting the Windrush generation in legislation and in the next government, no matter who they are, will be done. We need to mobilise in our numbers and push them. That's the only way it's going to happen.
Can I come back to you quickly? The question is actually, have you got any confidence that the Home Office, have you got any confidence as a Labour MP that the Labour Party will take that impactful action that will mirror the actions that were taken when the likes of Enoch Powell were making his utterances? And we do know that the policies were influenced by those utterances. Have you got any confidence that the Labour Party, have you got any confidence in the Labour Party that they're going to mirror those actions? Impactful action that will make those necessary changes. Have you got the confidence in the Labour Party? That's the question I'm asking.
Sorry, I don't, just to be absolutely clear, are you asking me if I think the Labour Party are going to go down the route of Enoch Powell?
No, that's not the question I'm asking. The question is, have you got confidence in the Home Office? Have you got confidence in the Labour Party that the Labour Party will take the necessary action to reverse those negative actions that impacted the Windrush generation? That is the question I'm asking.
Well, what I can take at this point in time, it is our policy, so they would have to, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm saying all of the necessary actions will not be taken unless they think it is important enough to decide whether or not it impacts people in the general election. That's the reality of the situation. So I can't say, I have no confidence that they will not do anything at all, because if there is enough push for it, they will have to. They absolutely have to.
Am I to take that as a yes, that you've got the confidence in the Labour Party?
I've got confidence that they will do it if it's going to impact an election, absolutely.
Okay, because frankly speaking, we are not quite there with the confidence.
No, I understand. And you know what, if it was today, right today, no, I don't think anything would happen.
When I said we're talking the Windrush generation and their descendants and others that are supporting us that has been impacted.
No, and as I said, I understand why you feel that way, and I do not think we have always done right as a party, 1,000,000%. But I can tell you that we haven't voted for the immigration legislation that came through recently, and we were quite pointed about that, even though I think we could have been stronger. Obviously, somebody like myself would say that. I would say that there are no MPs that want to be caught out at the moment, being seen to, pass legislation, be involved in anything that would impact the Windrush generation. That has 100% been guaranteed. But in terms of going a step further, it absolutely has to be a push for that, because at the moment, as long as people don't see anybody directly attacking the Windrush generation, as far as I'm concerned, everything is fine. You will hear Tory MPs saying things like, I don't know why these Labour MPs are still complaining. Everybody who's dealing with Windrush every Windrush case in my constituency has been dealt with, probably because they had about 3 or 4 and ignored the rest of them. But quite literally, it has to be for that further action, something that we all push on.
Thank you. Sorry, for means of time, because we are very overrun and we want to respect the next speakers. Thank you so much again to all the panelists here today. If you want to connect and take action, like has been mentioned, there's a wealth of different movements you can join. And yeah, take care, everybody. Thank you.